Are you looking to self-publish a book? Well, I'm Dr. Thrift from the Thriving Financially with Dr. Thrift podcast, and when I needed help, I turned to the host of the Begin Self-Publishing podcast, the one and only Tim Lewis.
Begin Self-Publishing, episode number 30, How to Price a Book.
Interested in self-publishing but don't know where to start? Want to get your book onto Amazon? Want to hold your paperback book in your hands? Learn how on the Begin Self-Publishing podcast with your host, Tim Lewis.
One of the topics I haven't covered in any detail is how to price a book. In general, there isn't a right answer to say, what should I price my book at? There are some price levels, certainly for ebooks, where it makes no sense to price your book. For example, in the US and in the UK and a lot of the other Amazon stores, you only get paid 70% royalties if your book is charged for a price that's the equivalent to over $2.99. So you can be 1 cent underneath $2.99, i.e. $2.98, and only receive 35% royalties rather than 70% royalties. You'll see a real lack of books on the Amazon store between the prices of 99 cents and $2.99. It doesn't make any sense for self-publishers to publish books in that price range. The 99-cent price range is used as a promotional price in general. So, for example, on my second Time Shop book, the first book is free, but the second book I put for 99 cents to encourage people who might be wavering on the side of buying it to buy that book. It's really designed ultimately to get people to buy the third book as well, which is on $2.99. I make all of my money on the $2.99 book. I don't make it on the first book or the second book, which are free and 99 cents respectively. In terms of most ebook pricing, I think that actually most ebooks indie authors produce are underpriced. Now, you have to be relatively competitive, but there's an awful lot of books on the market for $2.99 because of this minimum price to get the 70% royalties. I think for a novella or something along those lines, it's perfectly reasonable to charge $2.99 for an ebook. And in some ways, I wish that a lot of the longer novels were more like $4 or $5.99, and you will see a lot more of the more confident indie authors charging in this price range. There is also a maximum limit on Amazon for the 70% royalty, which is $9.99. I wouldn't suggest going too much above this unless your book is very specialist in some way, where it's the kind of knowledge that people will be prepared to pay extra for, because you will only get the 35% royalty above this. I'm not entirely sure if the 35% applies just to the revenue above this level or if it's for the whole amount, but certainly I wouldn't suggest ever really pricing your book over $9.99 on the US store because of this. I have seen actual published by publishing company ebooks for up to almost like £18. I don't know if they're really just trying to just deter people from actually buying the ebooks or if it's just a foolish pricing strategy. Obviously, I've never seen their accounts, so maybe they're selling hundreds of books at £18. But in general, I think most people should try and keep it under $9.99. For paperbacks, the whole situation is much more complicated. You really do need to do some maths. There are calculators on both the CreateSpace and the Ingram Spark website, which I'll list in my show notes attached to this show, and they will tell you how much it actually costs per book to produce a book on either CreateSpace or Ingram Spark. Now, in both situations, it's not as clear as it should be. CreateSpace has a very obscure royalty structure. They say that they pay the authors 60% royalties, but this isn't really true in any normal sense of the word. If you've got a $10 book, you're not going to get $6 of it in royalties from CreateSpace. What actually happens is that they calculate, based on the length of your book and what sort of book it is, a fixed price for the book. They then take this fixed printing price off the price of the book, and you get 60% of what's left. Unless, of course, you're on the CreateSpace expanded distribution scheme, where you only get 40% of what's left. Now, as I've said before, I don't recommend CreateSpace expanded distribution scheme, because even though it makes it theoretically possible to order your book in a bookstore, in practice, no bookstore is going to touch a CreateSpace book, partly because of the association with Amazon, but for the much more practical reason that they only get 20% of the list price. And this, by booksellers' standards, is too low to bother actually stocking your book. So you need to bear in mind what the actual fixed price that CreateSpace are charging for each copy of your book. You really want to be having your paperback book, depending on the purpose of why you want a paperback book. If you're hoping to make money out of paper, then you want to price your book considerably above the fixed cost so that you get that 60% of what's over. And this fixed cost can be $2 or $3 a book, anything up to $4 or $5 a book, depending on whether it's a colour book and the number of pages and lots of other details. You have to go to CreateSpace's calculator to try and work this out. So find out from CreateSpace how much your book is going to cost before you work out how much you're going to charge in terms of a price. Always set your price above the fixed cost. I say at least $1 or $2 above it at the very minimum. And then if you want your book to be stocked in bookstores, then I'd suggest you go for Ingram Spark instead of CreateSpace. And for international distribution, it might actually be cheaper at times to go for Ingram Spark anyway, as their delivery costs and printing costs globally are a lot cheaper than CreateSpace. Now, CreateSpace, obviously, are the supplier of choice for Amazon.com and the big Amazon stores. For Ingram Spark, there's a slightly complicated arrangement as well. They have a calculator that tells you how much their book printing costs and how much their delivery costs are. However, if you want to sell books through bookstores, then you'll need a bookseller to actually stock your book. This in itself is not straightforward, as you probably know from some of the previous episodes. The actual maths of this really does add on to your book price. The way to think about this is that in the normal terms, a bookseller will want a discount on the book price that only they get. And this is based on the actual retail price of the book in the bookstore. So let's say you've got a $10 paperback book. Typically, to stock your book, the booksellers will want to take 50% of that price, so they'll take $5 off. They're not going to want to take, as in the CreateSpace example, 50% of what's left after the cost of printing the book. They want 50% of the book price. So if your book costs more than $5 to print, then you're not going to make any money whatsoever from selling through a bookstore. The bookstore will make $5, and you'll make $5 minus the print cost. And this is a mistake I keep seeing over and over again with independent sellers who are trying to sell in bookstores. They price their paperback books way, way too low. It doesn't make sense to have a different price for the Amazon store than for the bookstores. So you need to really hike up your prices to cover this cost of this 50% discount. If you start getting into the world of sale and return, then you need to factor in the fact that you might get returns as well. And that'll add an extra cost in you'll need to account for in the profit margin on the books you do sell. When you actually look at stocking books in bookstores, you can see how economies of scale make a real difference in terms of bookstore distribution, and how actually the big publishing companies still have an advantage in this area. That said, it is possible for an indie author to get into a bookstore if they're prepared to price their book correctly. Please, please, please do the maths before you start approaching bookstores to actually stock your book. It may make very little sense to actually sell the book if you're only going to make a very tiny amount of money per book sold. I've heard stories of indie authors who lost money on book sales through bookstores because they've not counted into the fact that they've got to pay at least half the money off to the bookseller to actually sell their book for them. I'm less sympathetic in terms of the traditional publishers and their book sales on the online and ebook front, as they do seem to be profiteering in this area. But with the traditional book selling route, you can kind of see that actually book selling is quite a narrow margin activity.
You're listening to the Begin Self-Publishing Podcast with Tim Lewis.
Over and above these factors, a lot of book pricing comes down to either whether you're trying to promote a book or whether you're trying to make money from a book. What a lot of series authors like me do is that they make the first, or maybe the first few books in their series, available for either free or a fairly low, uneconomical price like 99 cents, in the hope that they'll then sell on later books in the series for more decent pricing. And this can work quite well as a pricing technique. But there is a real confidence issue that I've encountered thinking you're charging too much for your work. You can obviously compare yourself to every other book in the category, and I wouldn't stray massively above those prices, more than like $2 or $3. Don't put your 20-page book about fly fishing on for $9.99, for example. But on the other hand, if you've spent the time and money getting a professional editor and a decent cover, and your book content is very good, then don't be afraid to price it a few dollars more. You can always reduce it later. But it's very hard to increase the price of a book. If people have seen it on for $2.99 and then suddenly the next day it's $9.99, they're not going to be very happy about that. And you probably want some wiggle room in terms of reducing prices for promotions. So if you price your book at $2.99, then the only place you can really go is 99 cents. $1.99 in terms of dollar pricing is a bit of a dead zone. And you'll never, ever, ever see a book for $1.99 on the Amazon.com site because it makes no sense to have it at that price. So for a reasonable length book, say over 80,000 words, I don't think $4.99 is an unreasonable price at all. In fact, you may want to charge more than this. For non-fiction, you can get away with much higher prices, as for whatever reason, a lot of published non-fiction has very high ebook pricing. I've been looking for a few ebook business books to read lately, and some of the pricing in the Amazon.co.uk store is totally mad as far as I'm concerned. I don't really want to spend more than £10 on an ebook, but you'll see loads of marketing books available for this. In those particular cases, I'll probably get the audio book, because audio at least feels like you're getting more money's worth for £10 than for an ebook. So be careful not to overprice your work, but compared to a lot of the publishing companies, it's actually very hard to overprice your work because they seem to have that totally sewn up as far as ebooks go. Regarding your paperback and hardback versions, if you choose to create them, then do the maths first and work out exactly how much you're going to need to pay Ingram Spark or CreateSpace, or maybe a separate printer, and then add on a large margin on top of that. And if you intend to try and get your book available for order by bookstores, then make sure you take account of that 50% bookseller premium and that you can actually make money on what's left. I hope this has been helpful for you guys. Talk to you guys next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please stop by iTunes and rate and leave a review. This helps make the show more visible. For free resources, show notes, and other helpful content, join the community at beginselfpublishing.com.